This is Dr. Musser. Thanks for joining me for an introduction to biology. Biology to me is a fascinating field and something that everyone should have some familiarity with and understanding. Obviously, you already probably understand a lot of biology just to get by in this world, but understanding more can enrich your life and help you to see the world a little differently. Biology touches all sorts of areas. Biology, as you know, is known as the study of life, is kind of to me, the overall arching theme for a lot of fields, whether it be medicine, that's actually an applied biology field. Exercise science is an applied biology field. Psychology is a biology-like field dealing with the brain and behaviors. Agriculture is applied biology as well. And so biology is really important for us to survive and to understand ourselves. It does help us to get a better appreciation of things. Here we see Jane Goodall studying two chimpanzees. She got to see things about their emotions and behaviors and learning to help us to even understand ourselves. We have not evolved from chimpanzees, but these are living cousins. You can see, we understand where things might have come from by looking at the genes and the evolution of organisms. Here we see that from wolves, we were able to domesticate dogs, and then through artificial selection, we were able to shape them into all sorts of extremes. Here we have a Chihuahua and a Saint Bernard. But biology helps us to understand how does that work and why did that work. Even things like plants, you might not think of it, but there was never cabbages and broccolis in our far distant past. We actually selected mustard plants into these different species. Humans basically caused that plant to evolve in these different directions. Biology helps us to understand physiology and how the heart works. And then genetic engineering is changing all sorts of things in our world. Here they're showing that scientists were able to put a gene in that made these mole rats glow under light. You can also look into things like paleontology to understand Earth's living history, and we see animals that no longer exist. In fact, 99% of the animals that once lived on Earth no longer exist, the different species. Biology is also important for things like public health and understanding antibiotic resistance. And when you take an antibiotic and you don't finish that prescription, what happens is some of those bacteria still survive that happen to have a little bit of an advantage, a little bit more resistant to the antibiotic, and that population grows over time. That's evolution. And so biology helps us to understand lots of different things that help us to enrich our lives or help us to protect us or provide medicines or understanding who we are or where things came from. Biology, again, is the study of living things. And so right now, as far as we understand, this is what life is composed of. Because again, we only know of life based on one planet. We can conjecture that life is on all sorts of other planets, but again, would be still rare. But when we look at the five basic properties of life, we'll see that there's things like cells. We know all living organisms are composed of at least one cell. So you have single cellular organisms, and then you have multicellular organisms. But cells are the components of life. Viruses are not made of cells, for instance. So technically they're kind of lifelike, but it's arguable that they're not really living because they require a cell. So a virus is a parasite of a cell. It doesn't live on its own. Cells can live on their own. And so that's kind of where we start this. So viruses are kind of a gray area, that cells are what we consider the living component of life. You have to have a cell, and that's based on what we know, of course, our observations of life on Earth. We also know that all living organisms use energy. And how do they get the energy? In some cases, plants absorb light from, obviously plants absorb light from the sun. So the sun is actually the energy source for making life possible on Earth. And then there's animals that we call herbivores that eat plants. And then we have that animal available to be eaten by predators or omnivores, or they die and get decomposers take place. But that's how energy gets put through the system. Homeostasis is also an important component of living organisms. You know, when you get too hot, you start to sweat, so your body cools down. Your pH in your blood is carefully monitored. Everything needs to stay in homeostasis for a living organism to maintain its internal conditions and survive. Life also responds to stimuli. So, you know, if you get, you know, touch something hot, you move. Well, even little organisms and cellular organisms will move and respond to stimuli and adapt to that. So your muscle, if you're working out, your muscles get stronger. That's adaptation. There's also evolutionary adaptation that we'll get to later. Again, life is about growth, reproduction, and development. All living organisms grow and reproduce. And all living organisms have a genetic system based on DNA or RNA. But again, it's majority of life is DNA that's then transcribed into RNA. We'll get into that later too. But what is DNA? DNA is known as deoxyribonucleic acid. And that's where the inherited instructions are found on little segments or big segments called genes. And each one of these genes usually represents a protein that's going to get made. And then going on again about adaptation. In this case, we're going to talk about evolutionary adaptations where organisms evolve in their environment. I mentioned how, like, if you have you have let's say strep throat and you're sick, you'll take an antibiotic. That antibiotic will kill off that bacteria. However, in some cases, that bacteria has developed a resistance to the antibiotic. That's evolution, that's adaptation. Or if giraffes living in a certain environment where their food source is really tall, those giraffes with little longer necks pass on those genes for longer necks, and that population changes over time. Evolution is a change in alleles and gene frequency in a population over time. And we're going to get into more of that later. But these are the 5 components, the basic properties of life: cellular organization, energy use and metabolism, homeostasis, which is part of that, responses to stimuli, growth, reproduction, and development. We have DNA as that inherited instruction and adaptation, the ability to evolve in their environments. The animals we see today weren't the animals that we saw a million years ago necessarily. A lot of those have evolved and changed, or millions of years ago. Some can still be the same, but we'll get into a lot about how evolution works later. Now, the interesting thing about life is how complicated it is, and how and why you can study one little area of it and spend your entire life just trying to understand it. And at each level, it gets more complicated. It's already complicated at the chemical level when we talk about biochemistry. And then when you join biochemicals together and you got additional, enzymes and things like that, that gets even more complicated. And then it goes to a cellular level, and that's even more complicated. Or an organismal level, and that becomes complicated. Or a population level, that becomes even more complicated. So every level, you see this increase in complexity. And so here's a picture representing that, where you can see this is supposed to represent a water molecule. So it's very small. So this would be our hydrogen. Well, that's what I think this is supposed to be anyway. But these are all atoms here. So this is our oxygen and our 2 hydrogens. So this is our oxygen and 2 hydrogens. So that's complicated in its own right, just understanding how an atom works. And then when you join these different atoms together, you have larger molecules. And in the case of biology, we're talking carbon molecules as the backbone. And then these carbon molecules ultimately can form bigger structures and organelles, and then ultimately cells. And then these cells can join together to form tissues. These tissues can form together to form organs. These organs forms an organ system. and then you see an organism. So each one of these levels is more complicated. Here we see animal cells forming cardiac cells that form the heart, that form the cardiovascular system, and then of course there's all these other organ systems that form a more complex organism. Or you can have these, in the case of plants, you can see that the large molecules form plant cells. Plant cells join together to form things like tissues, leaf tissues in this case, leaves, and then of course you have roots and all sorts of organ systems. And we're ultimately have a very complex organism, a tree. So again, these are huge and differences in complexity as you go up these different scales. And then you go from organisms even to looking at population of organisms or a community of different types of organisms. So that becomes even more complex. So you go from your organism to a population of organisms, then to a community that includes things like the plants, the deer, the insects. That's all in that one region. And then you have an ecosystem that's on a much larger scale that includes the things like the rocks and an environment. So you might have a desert ecosystem or a tundra and all these different types of ecosystems. We'll get into that a little later. And then ultimately the Earth is the most complex of the biosphere of the Earth. So each one of these levels becomes dramatically more complex as you move up the scale. And so we start to see emergent properties when we say this more complexity. So like what we see in an individual molecule or individual cell is one set of properties, but then when you join a bunch of cells together, you see a dramatic increase in emergent properties and how those multi-cells work together as a tissue. So each one of those levels is dramatically greater. And it's not always that easy. You have to really kind of get down to it and try to study it. So just reducing it doesn't always help you to understand it. It's because you see things that maybe you didn't see beforehand. So you see different types of metabolism, different types of interactions. Ultimately, the cells in our body can form consciousness. You don't have consciousness that necessarily exists outside your body. The body and mind is connected. And those are emergent properties. Now, so that's the first example. Also, we're going to talk about energy and use and metabolism. That's an important part of living organisms. Organisms have biochemical reactions. So cells are basically stacks of biochemical reactions. And all of that requires energy. And that energy ultimately comes from the sun. And so if you don't have sunlight putting energy into the system, you have ultimately entropy where things are going into a chaotic mess. And so the sun isn't there. You'll go substances, molecules, everything kind of goes into disorder. However, the sun keeps everything moving by putting energy into the system, and so it allows it to stay connected. So here we see a picture of the sun coming in. It's providing the energy needed for photosynthesis, and it causes producers to produce food. And these are producers, we're talking about things like plants, green algae, and things like that. They're taking the sunlight, turning that into plant material or algae material, and then consumers will eat the plants, and that provides the nutrients to the animals that are in that ecosystem. And so then those producers or those consumers die, and then there's still nutrients available for things that are what we call decomposers. These are things like bacteria and fungi. So consumers are going to be things like herbivores and carnivores and omnivores. And then decomposers are going to be things like fungus and bacteria and stuff like that. And so producers make all this happen. But the one thing about living on the earth that we know is something eats something else when it comes to consumers. So it's impossible for a consumer to survive without eating another organism, whether it be other animals or other plants or whatever. All that energy, all that happens thanks to plants producing the food or algae and things like that. It depends on the ecosystem, of course. We talked about homeostasis in that first slide, again, about what is necessary for an organism. The ability of an organism to maintain its internal environment is critical for its survival. We've already know that, for instance, if you're really hot, you're going to sweat, and that's going to help bring your body temperature down. If it goes unregulated, you're going to die. So homeostasis is critical. If you start getting cold, you're going to start shivering. That's going to increase your body temperature. Without homeostasis, ultimately a cell or plant or organism is going to die. And all these different organisms, all these living organisms, whether it be a plant or human, we think of human examples, but all of them are going through some type of homeostasis. You know, you have fish in a saltwater environment. They have to go through homeostasis to keep the right conditions in their body. So fish in the sea, for instance, will get rid of excess salt so that their body is maintained. So this happens to us, of course, too. If we eat too much salt, we're going to pee out more salt. Homeostasis is critical for organisms to survive. The plants or animals' ability to respond to the environment is irritability. So like if you get bright light, you're going to close your eyes, for instance. That's irritability. Organisms that, I can put a little bacteria under or a little amoeba or something under a microscope slide, and the light will be intense on that amoeba, and the amoeba will actually swim away under that cover slip. That's irritability. This animal here can pick up on, that's living under the soil, can pick up on an organism walking by and go up and eat it. In this case, it looks like a snake. You can see that the leaves have also evolved an adaptation. So adaptation is important. This leaf has evolved the ability to have this folding mechanism. So when a heavy windstorm comes through, the leaves will roll up and not tear off the plant. That's an adaptation that happened over evolutionary time. So that's how leaves got their shape. Instead of just being a big pad, unless it's in an area where there's not a lot of wind. So areas where there's lots of wind, the leaves you'll see tend to have those shapes that allow them to flow in the wind and not be damaged. And that's what's happening in this picture here. That is an evolutionary adaptation. And then we call that natural selection. So the environment is selecting those traits. So just to kind of give you a different example, when you have dogs and people breed dogs that have different characteristics, we call that artificial selection. And when nature does it, we call it natural selection. When humans do it, we call it artificial selection. That's some of those to be aware of. So again, growth and development are critical for living organisms. Some animals, some animals, but some organisms have what we call asexual reproduction. This is often described for unicellular organisms. Again, asexual is kind of maybe I'm stretching a little bit when I talk about animals, but there are some parthogenic animals that are a single sex, like they're all female and able to reproduce. So I would say that's a form of asexual reproduction. But we're talking about here bacteria dividing. And so you can see the bacteria dividing. That's asexual reproduction. Sex is actually really important. It's what provides diversity to organisms. And so that seems to help in evolution because it provides more variation within a population. You're a little bit different because you have your mother and your father. So you're going to have genes from both of them. That gives you and your siblings a little bit more diversity because of that sexual reproduction. Asexual organisms, for instance, don't have much diversity. So these bacteria are nearly identical to each other. But sexual reproduction is important and it helps to provide more variety in a population of individuals. and that helps in adaptation and evolution. And so that's, so that's how, so again, organisms must reproduce to survive, and if they only reproduce with each other, we call that a species. So we have a species of white-tailed deer. They can't reproduce with elk, even though that's kind of another deer-like species. But we can assume that they must have shared a common ancestor and were related to some unknown common ancestor, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, of millions of years ago, whenever that population evolved. But once those individuals only can reproduce with each other, we call that a species. But again, this is critical for life: growth, development, reproduction. That's a characteristic, one of those 5 characteristics of life. So life evolves, and that is another thing that we know of. And that's another characteristic of life. So evolution is a genetic change in a species over time, and it's an ongoing process. This is something I really want to kind of emphasize. Evolution is small incremental changes over time. So in this case, we have a bunch of finches, and all these birds are related to a common ancestor of finches that went to these different islands where these were the only food sources around. And so then this population of finches, when they went to these different islands, started evolving these other characteristics to survive on that particular island. So like these ground finches are specialized at eating seeds. They have a big beak. These finches have small beaks that help them to eat from flowers and cacti. These beaks on this finches have small beaks that helps them to eat bugs. And then this one is actually a woodpecker finch that can eat insects. So, when I hear silly things once in a while, like evolution, some creationist website, well, a cow can't turn into a whale. Well, nobody says that. Nobody ever says that. Humans didn't come from monkeys either. But the idea is that we all share a common ancestor. All these finches, and so a finch evolves into another type of finch. They may have evolved from a different type of bird species. And also, we believe birds evolved from dinosaurs based on transitional species like Archaeopteryx. We have fossils of dinosaurs with feathers. They have teeth and they have eggs. So there's a lot of characteristics. There's reasoning behind this, but we don't know ultimately because none of us lived back then. So scientists are like detectives. We look at the evidence, we see fossils, and we try to put the pieces together. It's never going to be absolutely perfect. But what we know is that evolution is a change in species over time. And it happens in a population. It doesn't happen in individual. So individuals don't evolve. Populations and groups of individuals evolve. And so if you could imagine a group of birds were on this island, and then they found a food source, and then they learned to start eating that food source. That would be an example of evolution. And they learned how to, and then they become more specialized. And over time, that population starts getting a more narrow beak or a more big beak, depending on the food source. Where does this variation come from is in the DNA. That's where ultimately this is being selected for. There's mutations in DNA that provide more variety. Some mutations make the dog a little hairier, or one dog a little less hairy. And then we select them. In this case, we were the selective force. We selected hairy dogs, or we selected these other dogs with a different trait. That's human-driven evolution. We call that artificial selection. All these fruits and this corn did not exist until we selected plants that could form these big kernels. That's all evolution, but it's human-driven evolution. We also have good evidence that our domesticated dogs evolved from wolves. The idea is that wolves would have come around a human population, maybe ate some of the scraps, and those wolves that were a little less aggressive weren't chased off or killed off got to hang out a little bit easier around human communities. So animals that can hang around humans and not attack them are more likely to survive when they're around humans. And so over time, the idea is that there was the more docile wolves became human interactions, and then they just started forming an intimacy with humans, and then the population changed to kind of a common dog, and then humans ran with it, and breeders started taking on those traits that made dogs possible. Actually, I'm going to show you a video that helps you to understand how this can happen even in a short period of time, where another experiment was actually done in Russia looking at foxes and how they were selected to make them more docile. So this will give you an idea of a parallel to how domesticated dogs came from wolves. Let me see if I can find you a video on that for a moment. All right, so this is a video of domestication of fox, and then I'll show a quick little clip of how wolves may evolve from dogs, or dogs evolved from wolves. That means they shared a common ancestry. Well, let's get into it. We'll kind of hit on some of these points. So this is fair use for educational purposes.
In 1959, the Russian zoologist Dmitry Belyov started one of the longest-running scientific studies on canine domestication. Belyov began with 130 silver foxes that lived on a commercial fur farm in Estonia.
So this guy, as you can see, they had these silver foxes. So this is the wild population. Initially, it hasn't been that far removed from what was found in the wild. And so they're wild foxes that are part of the fur trade at the time. And so the scientist decides to start breeding them based on the traits that he sees.
Belyov selected foxes that display tameness toward humans. Only the tamest of these foxes, 20 to 25%, were selected to breed the next generation of tame fox kit.
So again, this might be what happened in the wolf to dog story, where tameness, those wolves that were the more tame and less aggressive got to hang out closer to the tribe and not be chased away or killed. We see that even with things like coyotes. They learn to live in the environment, even though they're still, wild animals, foxes, anything that doesn't completely scare the shit out of, shoot out of people, sheet out of people, they can kind of hang out. We're not going to have grizzly bears running through Macomb. But we'll let coyotes, we're not going to let wolves run through Macomb either. So animals that can live in an environment with humans get to hang out. And that's one of the reasons why coyotes are so successful. Well, in this case, the scientists specifically looked at tameness in the fox, and only those foxes that seemed kind of happy. So behaviors are actually genetic as well. Some people, even people, we see that some people are nicer than other people. Some of that's learned, some of that's actually genetic. Well, that's what was being looked at here in these foxes. So the fox is a little more, tame acting, meaning they weren't as aggressive when they saw the human when they walked by the cage. They act aggressive with their teeth out. He didn't breed those. He bred the ones that didn't have their teeth out.
Let's follow what Belyov and his scientists observed after breeding tame foxes with one another for over 40 generations.
40 generations.
In the first generation, the researchers would have seen foxes which look very much like their wild relatives.
Ears.
Wild silver fox ears stand upright on their head immediately after birth, and their tails point downward. Their hair is brown at the base and silver black tipped along the hair follicle.
So it's keeping its wild trait here.
As they began breeding tame fox individuals with one
It
another,
wasn't related to anything. So they're completely inbreeding these foxes based on their behavior. And so they currently look like they're wild type, meaning what they see in the environment.
the researchers would have already noted behavioral changes in fox
see coloration changes. And we think that some of this tameness is linked to the puppy-like behaviors. Puppies are more docile than adult foxes. And so they weren't intending to mess with the colors of the foxes. They were just worried about the tameness. But unknowingly to the researchers, they were beginning to breed these different puppy-like traits, these color-like traits. The ears will become less pointed and start being more floppy like a puppy. So we call that neoteny. So we're seeing some neoteny-like traits in the fox showing up.
a fur pattern characteristically seen in domesticated species in which hair is both pigmented and unpigmented, or white. Around the 9th generation, researchers begin to see foxes that retain juvenile traits.
Only after 9 traits,
No
they're already
longer do
starting
the
to
ears
look
on these
totally
foxes
different
stand
from dog
upright
traits.
directly after
Quite a bit
birth like
different.
their wild counterparts. These foxes have floppy ears for longer periods of time, up to 3 months. Foxes in the 13th generation begin to display another trait common in domestic dogs: tails rolled in a circle. The tail of a wild fox 15 to 20 breeding generations, foxes began to be born with shorter tails and legs. Researchers even noted foxes
Again, we're starting to see more and more puppy-like traits. So this is within a short period of time, we're seeing evolution. Now, they're still the same species, but they're a lot different now. The population's changing based on the artificial selection of the researcher.
that had tails between 3 to 6 vertebrae shorter in length than their wild fox relatives. After years of breeding tame foxes with one another, the researchers had officially created a new breed, the Russian domesticated red fox.
So this is how domestication occurs. When we talk about domesticated cows, domesticated cats, domesticated dogs, it's through this process of selecting tameness. And then, of course, you can run with it and start making Chihuahuas and St. Bernards if you're talking about dogs. That was all domestication. Even when we talk about the broccoli and the corn plants and stuff like that we eat today, that's domestication of plants. And that's all examples of evolution.
In 1999, 70 to 80% of the experimentally selected fox population were classified as domesticated. Domesticated foxes display a variety of coat colors, from the piebald coloration characteristic to all domestic species, to variations on the original classic red fox coloration, and various combinations of silver and white patterns. These foxes have short tails that curl upwards, as seen in other domestic dog breeds, such as the Shiba Inu. These individuals are friendly, docile, and social, often displaying attention-seeking behavior towards humans, such as playing, whimpering, licking, and nuzzling.
So we see these behaviors in our pets. We selected those traits. The reason why your cat wants to jump on your lap is the fact that they've been domesticated around humans. Now, I know that if you left some cats outside, they might become feral and not imprint on you. But we domesticated cats or domesticated dogs to seek our approval, because again, unknowingly, like this research was purposely selecting that tameness trait. But we were doing it, but unofficially, not in an experiment. So cats that or dogs that bite usually get put down in the past and they get to breed, usually. So then they become more domesticated. Cats, cats are manipulating your behavior to feed them. My cat will follow me over to the bowl and make sure I notice it's time to feed him, or start rubbing against my legs. I got the cats for my kids, but the point is that's all evolved behaviors, and then of course they learn and can do some other things with it, but they weren't a blank slate.
The behavioral and physiological changes of individual foxes over generations of selective breeding provide an important model for domestication. This study allowed humans to observe and record the domestication process from generation 1 on, something no one had ever done before. How did a wolf turn into a pug, or an African wildcat into a Maine Coon cat? Next time you interact with a domesticated animal, think about the behavioral and physical changes that had to occur over generations of breeding to produce the animal you see today.
Again, this is all evolution also. I'm going to have you watch this video on your own as an assignment. How did dogs get domesticated and some of the ideas behind it. It's a short 10-minute video. It's really interesting and fascinating. They found this puppy that they call dog ore, and the reason why they call it dog ore is, was it a dog or was it basically some kind of transitional domestication from wolves? So that's why they call it dog ore. And so they found this in Siberia, and so the idea is, and you'll see, is that during this period of time, this is about 18,000 years ago, they were finding this population, and they think that, again, less aggressive wolf-like animals were hanging around tribes because they could get scraps and things like that. And those that weren't terrifying and aggressive got to hang out closer to those tribes of people, and then they might get fed scraps, and kind of this is the basic idea that they come a little closer. Remember, wolves are a sociable creature to begin with, so we're just taking advantage of that trait that already exists by finding hypersocial individuals, and then they bond to humans. So you're not going to, all of a sudden change a animal that doesn't have any social characteristics, like say like a robin, into a domestic bird that's going to be flying on your shoulder easily. It's going to remain wild, even though we do get some parakeets and stuff. But this, but again, we're picking on animals, not picking on, but taking on or domesticating animals that already kind of have that basic trait of being sociable. And so that's where they look at, then the idea is that those wolf-like, dog-like animals started forming more bonds with their own human family members than wolves themselves. And so that's where, and then we start selecting traits, and so you're going to get to learn a little bit more from this. But this talks about just the ways that all this might have occurred. again, we're like scientists, or excuse me, we're like detectives at a crime scene. The crime already occurred. The detective comes and gathers evidence and puts together a story, an explanation. Well, that's what's happening here. And then we're looking at DNA, we're looking at, dog lore, and they're getting an idea of, they're trying to figure out, was dogs domesticated from wolves once? Was it twice? Was it multiple times? These are the kind of things that these scientists try to figure out. And then, of course, dogs come up with different jobs based on those selections and help them with hunting. And then they find that certain genes start to exist in dogs that allow them to eat more starchy meals. So dogs and wolves are both carnivores, but domesticated dogs are able to eat a cooked potato better than a wolf can. So there's some genes that start to show up again because of this domestication process and eating what the humans are eating. Humans are omnivores, so we eat meat and plant and other things, fungi too. We can eat just about anything. That's one of the things that makes us successful. Obviously, if you walked outside in the woods over here, you're not going to find a lot to eat. You're going to eat the animals mostly. So some ecosystems, there's more plants to eat. Some ecosystems, there's more animals to eat. And humans had to be able to eat animals to survive in the Arctic, for instance, where it's whale blubber and all that stuff. Well, domesticated dogs have the ability to eat starchy stuff that was associated with the humans that were growing or eating starchy things. So they're eating some of the scraps that the humans have. And so you see more selection, evolutionary selection for starchy genes, allows them to digest. Remember, the genes will make enzymes that help them to digest the starch. So that's important. So anyway, I want you to watch this video. I'll make it like a little assignment for you. And I think it's really a fascinating one that you will enjoy. All right, so that should give you a little bit more information about why you have evidence for things like this, evolutionary evidence. Again, these plants, we selected them for, and that's an example of human-directed evolution. You're never going to turn a tomato plant into a corn plant. Or you might turn a little tomato into a bigger tomato, or little grasses into something that you can eat, corn. That's all evolutionary selection. And these plants didn't exist until humans selected them and made them into cauliflower, broccoli. They selected different parts. They selected the leaves to make the kale. They selected the flowery parts to make the cauliflower or the broccoli. Those are flowers you're eating. So again, this is through human-directed evolution. I think we all can agree that if we didn't have chihuahuas running around 1,000,000 years ago, or even 10,000 years ago, this was selection by humans. St. Bernards. Those things didn't exist until humans domesticated dogs, wolves to dogs, and then started making these different breeds. So this is proof that populations change and can evolve. We call this microevolution when we're talking about these kind of traits. From wolf to dog, that's actually a species change. That's macroevolution. These finches change, that's evolution. When you take an antibiotic and get antibiotic resistance, that's evolution. When the COVID virus variants change, remember all that stuff that was happening? That's evolution too. Every time the virus changes, we have to come up with a new vaccine, or we get a new cold virus or new flu virus. That's all evolution. And that's, again, viruses aren't living, but they're lifelike. It's a complex kind of thing. The other thing is the diversity of life. Let's talk a little bit about that now. We categorize organisms into 6 different kingdoms. And we also have these things we call domains. Domains is the type of cell they come from. We have some cells that we call prokaryotes. These are our bacteria cells that have no nucleus. Your cells and plant cells have a nucleus. All of this, I'm sure you might have remembered from high school. They have a cell wall that's made of a peptidoglycan. That's one kingdom of bacteria. These are the ones that, like the E. coli and the bacteria you might have heard of, strep throat, streptococcus, all that kind of stuff. We have another group of bacteria we call extremophiles, and they come from the domain archaea. So domain bacteria are E. coli and all that kind of stuff that are everywhere around you. And then we have the kingdom archaea, which is another type of bacteria species, but these are extremophiles. Again, they lack a nucleus, but they can live in extreme environments like really hot or really cold or in a sulfur environment and get their food from there. And they have a different type of cell wall. Their cell walls are not made of peptidoglycan. And this is actually relatively new stuff. I think this was kind of figured out in the last 20, 30 years. I'm not sure exactly, where they started separating these 2 different kingdoms. Before it was just all one big kingdom. When I was going through school, that's how it was taught. So both of these kingdoms are unicellular. They both lack a nucleus. They both have a cell wall. There are some that are autotrophs, and make sure I explain what an autotroph is. That means they make their own food. And this is going to be things like photosynthesis with the sunlight or sulfur. And then some are heterotrophs. That means they eat something else, just to make sure you understand that term. Then we have these other kingdoms that made up of cells called eukaryotes, and we call that eukarya here. These are cells with a true nucleus, true organelles. So you think about the mitochondria or the chloroplasts in plants. Plants have chloroplasts and mitochondria. These are where you and other more complex multicellular organisms exist. So again, there's 6 different kingdoms. I'll put one more finger up. It used to be 5 when I was growing up in school. It's 6 kingdoms. 2 extreme bacteria, regular bacteria. And then we have protists, which are our protozoans and our algae and our slime molds. We have fungi, which are our molds or mushrooms and things like that. We have plants. And we have animals. So all of these are the 4 other kingdoms. Protists, again, are amoebas and sponges, or not sponges, excuse me. Sponges are a type of animal. And that's kind of where you start getting kind of almost a transitional kind of thing, but we'll get into sponges some other day, maybe. So in a kingdom protists, we see that they're unicellular. They can have cells kind of connected together, though. They do have a true nucleus. They can have cell walls. They can be autotrophs or heterotrophs. They can either make food like algae, photosynthesis, not like algae, that's what they do. Or some that'll eat like amoebas. So those are all part of the protists. Our other kingdom is plants. These are multicellular organisms. Again, they're all going to have a nucleus and other organelles. They're going to have a cell wall made of cellulose. You can't digest cellulose. Cows can with the help of bacteria. But when you eat corn on the cob and some of that corn comes out the backside, that's the cellulose that you can't digest. When you break a celery stick, you're hearing snapping of cell walls in the cellulose there. Trees, that's all cellulose. So that's autotrophs, they're making food 99% of the time. There's some parasitic plants and some stuff like that, but the majority of them are making their own food, and they have complex organelles. Complex, that means a lot farther. They have little, like xylem and phloems for moving food or nutrients around in the plants. They have roots, they have, leaves. These are all complex organs and combined make an organism, as we talked about. Then we have fungi. These are multicellular, though there are some examples of unicellular as well. Their cell walls made up of chitin, and they're heterotrophs, but they're going to be decomposers for the most part, where they're absorbing nutrients. They're going to have they're going to do extracellular digestion and absorb it. And you can find fungi everywhere, and some fungi are pathogenic. Some fungi are going to be decomposers in the soil. Then we're going to be in the kingdom that are animalia, and that includes us. So animals are multicellular. And when somebody says humans and animals, no, humans are animals. We're multicellular. We're heterotrophs. We have complex organ systems. We have no cell walls. That's the definition of an animal, and we're part of that kingdom. Insects are animals. I run into smart people that don't know that insects are actually animals. Again, they're multicellular. They have they're eukaryotic cells. They're heterotrophs, and they have complex organ systems. And so that's how we do the classification. We call that taxonomy or systematics, depending on how. If you put it from an evolutionary perspective, it's systematics, or taxonomy is the naming. It's basically the science of naming organisms. And the biodiversity is critical for ecosystems to be successful. Again, here's our kingdoms. Remember, there's 6 different kingdoms. Here's bacteria, archaebacteria, protists, plants, fungi, and animalia. So these are our 6 kingdoms. The bacteria are here. We have archaea, and then all these are eukaryote. Remember, eukaryotic cells. Just remember that should definitely show up on a test somewhere. And the idea is this is the tree of life. And the idea is that all these organisms share a common ancestor. Why do we think that? Because they're all cellular. They're all made up of DNA. And so the simplest of life on Earth initially would have been some type of bacteria. And then that broke off into these 3 different groups over evolutionary time. We're talking billions of years, hundreds of millions of years. We get bacteria breaking off in protists. And from protists, we start to see the other organisms evolve from. Again, that means that we share a common ancestor with all of this, and all of this has DNA. And we have there's a recent study that I just came across where they're talking about what is the living common ancestor for all of this. But from protists, we have green stuff that becomes plants. Protist that doesn't have green stuff, and of course we call that chloroplast and chlorophyll. The chlorophyll lives is part of the chloroplast. That's where photosynthesis occurs. That's what ultimately this algae evolves into these plants. Or if they're decomposers, they become fungi. And then there are some protists that have little flagella, tail-like structures and live in colonies that we think becomes the simplest animals like sponges. And from there we get more complex animals like jellyfish and other types of worms, and then we get into vertebrates later. In fact, this picture is kind of a misnomer. It kind of makes it look like that most animals are vertebrates. The vast majority of animals are actually invertebrates. But we are part of these animals. That's what this tree is trying to show you. So we have vertebrates, and then we got amphibians, and then we got reptiles, and then mammals evolved from a reptile like share a common ancestor, and then we have humans. And that's all part of that tree of life. And every branch has these complexities. We're just showing one example of mammals. We are a mammal because we're warm-blooded. We have fur. Hair is fur. We have mammary glands that allow us to provide nutrients to our young. That's what makes it a mammal. We are mammals, a type of animal. So when we talk about taxonomy, and we're talking about human classification, this is how it boils down. We are in the domain eukarya, for eukaryotic cells. Humans are in the kingdom Animalia, because we're multicellular heterotrophs. We're in the phylum, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Domain's the biggest. We're in the phylum Chordata, which ultimately leads to vertebrates, backbones. We're in the class Mammalia. Well, there's other types of classes, like reptiles. But we're in Mammalias because we have fur, mammary glands, sweat glands, warm-blooded. Endothermic is what we call that. We're in the order primates because we're part of the primates. We're just another type of ape. We didn't evolve from chimpanzees. We have a common ancestor. There are living cousins. There's lots of other hominids that existed on Earth, like Neanderthals. We are in a family called Hominidae. So Neanderthals would be in Hominidae. Yes. And then we are Homo sapiens. Neanderthals are actually Homo neanderthalis. But they don't exist anymore. But we do have some humans, a big chunk of humans, like myself even, where we have some Neanderthal genes still present, about 2% in my case. Scientific names are always what we call binomial. So there's two names. So we're Homo sapiens. That is our scientific name. Neanderthals were Homo neanderthalis, for instance, are one of our extinct ancestors. So there are hominids that are extinct now. Again, that's called binomial nomenclature. The first name is the genus name. The second name is the species name. And we italicize scientific names. So you see how this is italicized? And every time you see IADA, that knows that's a family name, for instance. Well, anyway, this is how classification occurs. And you can see how it can be important for, and then another important aspect about biology, providing names for all these tens of thousands of species. Just in beetles alone, there's over 300,000 species. And it would be Animalia, it would be insects, and then it'd be Coleoptera for beetles, and you do the same exact thing. Anytime you see IDAE, again, that means it's a family name. And so, again, some take-home messages. This is called binomial nomenclature. It's a two-name system, right? So we have scientific names either underlined or italicized. And so I think you get some of the gist of what you need to know. Realize that there's these 6 different kingdoms. That's a take-home message. And then know the, the 5 things that make up all living organisms, and then look at some of the examples. So anyway, thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a good rest of the day, and I'll be ready for the next lecture pretty soon. Take care and have a good day. Bye.